Hi class. Finally getting to recording this video for you guys on chapters 9 and 10. This video will focus on chapter 9, public opinion and persuasion. So the chapter starts out by defining what public opinion is. And so public opinion is just really important when you talk about public relations. Shaping public opinion is a lot of what we do. And so there's a lot of misconceptions that what we do is actually manipulation, but it's really not. Persuasion is a process, and when done properly, it's far from manipulation, and it yields some really great results for your client or for your organization or for the person that you're working for. So in terms of definitions of public opinion, there are several definitions that exist. And so the definition itself is quite elusive. And the most common definition that we use is that public opinion is the sum of individual opinions on an issue affecting those individuals. The concept of self-interest is really important in this definition. And it also talks about, the book also talks about events as an important factor in the formation of public opinion. So when we talk about self-interest, obviously we form our public opinions on what's best for us, for our own self-interests. So for example, when we talk about politics and government, right, we would most likely align ourselves without any in-depth research, right, with a candidate or a form of government that aligns more closely with our own self-interest. So, and then when we talk about events, they're a trigger for the formation of public opinion, and events can also swing public opinion. So, for example, when 9/11 happened, I'm sure that the majority of the public wasn't even thinking about going to war, a war in Afghanistan, a war in Iraq. But after such a huge event took place, right, the majority of our country, I can't say our entire country, but the majority of our country swung in favor of going to war. So it's really important to understand that public opinion is also shaped by your environment and current events issues. So the book goes on to talk about opinion leaders as catalysts in shaping and forming public opinion. There are two types of opinion leaders. There are formal opinion leaders and informal opinion leaders. When we talk about formal opinion leaders, we're talking about people like our president. We're talking about, maybe the CEO of a particular company. So they're people that are actually they're also called power leaders. They can be our elected officials, presidents of companies, heads of membership groups, and their statements are considered by the mass media on particular issues relative to their areas of concern. So if we are talking about the Zika virus, and the media is looking to do a story on the Zika virus, they would seek out an opinion leader in the medical community. And so we would take their opinions when we see it on the news or in the paper, and we would believe those opinions to be true or credible based on who they are. So those are formal opinion leaders. Informal opinion leaders are highly informed people. They're articulate, they're credible on particular issues, and they can exert considerable amounts of influence on their peer groups, but they're not formal. The book goes on to talk about the flow of opinion. And they outline three particular theories: the two-step flow theory, the multi-step flow theory, and the N-step flow theory. So when we talk about the two-step flow theory, it states that people rely on person-to-person communication with formal and informal opinion leaders. But research has recently proven that this is actually a multi-step flow, right? It's not just a two-step flow, it's a multi-step flow. It starts with opinion makers. The public that's interested in an issue rely on opinion leaders to provide them with information. Normally, in this multi-step flow theory, the inattentive public stay out of the process, and some members of the inattentive public become interested in or at least aware of the issues through the multi-step flow theory. The N-step theory is a variation of the two-step model. It says that individuals interact with different leaders around one issue to form an opinion. So your book uses the example of a medical opinion. So if you go to the doctor's office and you get a bad report, what do you do, following that bad report to formulate your opinion as to whether or not you want to move forward with a course of treatment or you want to take a certain medication? You're going to go and you're going to speak to various opinion leaders, right? So you're going to maybe get a second opinion from another doctor. You're going to talk to your family and friends. You're going to see what they think about it. You're going to ask them, hey, do you know anybody else with this particular medical condition? What's worked for them? Does it fall in line with what this particular person told me? And so when you ask people for their opinions and when you ask those people for their beliefs on what you should do or how you should form your opinion, you're consulting with an informal opinion leader. And you're actually promulgating this N-step theory. Now let's talk about the role of the mass media in public opinion, in informing public opinion, and in this whole concept of persuasion, right? When we talk about basically what we do as public relations professionals on a day-to-day basis is really engaging with the mass media. The mass media is kind of our tool to get our message out to the masses, right? And so there's a few different theories that are associated with the mass media. The first that the book talks about is the agenda setting theory. And so what that theory basically says is that media content sets the agenda for public discussion, right? It says basically that the media tells people what to think about, not particularly what to think, but what to think about. The media influences the public's subjective thoughts and not entirely the thought itself, which is what I just said. An agenda is propagated through public discussion, right? Within that spectrum, there's the limited effects model of mass media, which basically says that mass media functions through a combination of mediating factors and influences. And the factors may include public opinions that leaders analyze and interpret. And then there's the second level agenda setting effects of mass media, which says that media not only sets the agenda, but also conveys a set of attributes to the news. And getting a subject on the media agenda is considered an accomplishment from a public relations standpoint. And that's absolutely true. Once we get a placement on media, it's a huge accomplishment. And so I think that a lot of people nowadays, especially with everything that's going on in the world, when we talk about the mass media, a lot of people really do believe in this particular theory because, when we talk about what is popular, what is important, what people are talking about in today's society, there are so many things that are going on all over the world. But if the media is talking about the Kardashians, obviously we're going to talk about the Kardashians. Obviously that's going to be the most important thing on our radar, right? And not the things that are going on overseas or the things that are going on even when this whole idea or this whole crisis, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan started. A lot of us, it was on our periphery because it was maybe mentioned on TV or we've seen an article on Facebook, but it really wasn't mainstream media. We were talking about all the other things. We were talking about the presidential debates. We were talking about Donald Trump. And obviously those things are important. But the fact that the water crisis was kind of a subtopic for quite some time really gives credence to agenda setting theory. So the next theory that we talk about is media dependency theory. And it basically says that media content can have moderate or powerful effects on public opinion, and that the media is directly influencing the public's thoughts. Particularly when people have no prior knowledge on a topic. And this is really evident in crisis situations, right? Because people are getting information that they generally can't verify, right? Because they have no prior experience with these topics. And so they're relying on journalists, they're relying on the media to really tell them what to think, right? And this is really important in crisis, like I said, in crisis situations, especially in situations where people might be in a public panic. Again, with 9/11, people were generally overrun by a sense of fear. It had been the first foreign attack on U.S. soil. People didn't know what to think about. People weren't familiar with a lot of these policies, and they were relying on the media to give them information. The same thing throughout the war in Afghanistan and throughout the war in Iraq. We're relying on information that's being passed to us by the media. And so it's not surprising that later on, amidst all of these conflicts, we come to find out that a lot of media outlets are retracting stories or are admitting that they kind of played to this idea of yellow journalism and played on people's fears, right? And so basically, it's really important in crafting messages that we understand that a lot of people are dependent on what the media puts out there. Their opinions can change, can shift, from one side of the pendulum to the other in quite a short amount of time, especially in a crisis situation, because a lot of times they're depending on the opinions or they're depending on the media to give them fact. The next theory that the book talks about is framing theory, and it basically relates to how journalists frame stories. It's a process of selection of certain facts, themes, treatments, and even words, and it influences public opinion and policy formation. So framing is a continuing process, and it affects behaviors, attitudes, cognition, affective states of individuals, and affects how they interpret issues. Public relations, there are two types of framing. There's audience framing and media framing. And for public relations professionals, we talk about, we use framing to determine how choices, attributes, and actions can lead to favorable outcomes. It influences people in subtle ways and has a significant form on the persuasive effect. So basically, when we talk about framing, you see a lot of framing in the court of law. Lawyers frame arguments all the time. And I think it's a really important thing that you guys understand. And I think that using a court of law as an example is, it simplifies it in a way that you'd really be able to understand. So if I'm a lawyer and I'm in the courtroom, there's a defense attorney, there's a prosecutor, there's two sides. And there's two sides to every argument, right? And so each side will try and frame that argument in their favor. So a lot of people think that this is manipulation, but it's really not, especially when you're doing it in a factual way. It's called persuasion. And so basically, we take the facts that are given to us and we frame them in a certain way to promote a positive image, a positive outcome for our client or our organization. The next theory the book talks about is conflict theory. And so when we think of conflict, we automatically think of a negative. And conflict in and of itself definitely isn't negative. It creates a constructive process that builds towards consensus, right? And so it regulates and helps ensure social stability, and it regulates peaceful change in a democratic society. I think that a great example of this is Donald Trump, right? In and of himself, he is a conflict. He's a conflict to everyone. He's a conflict to Democrats. He's a conflict to Republicans. But the one thing that comes from Donald Trump is that people have now begun to organize from all sides, right? And what is the consensus? The consensus is that the majority of people, no matter what side you're on, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, even people that generally support Donald Trump as a businessman, have come together to really say our general consensus is that Donald Trump, you're a terrible, terrible candidate for presidency. And so while a lot of I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I've held this position that Donald Trump is just a scare tactic, right? It's a tactic, and how cool would it be if Donald Trump was paid to run for the presidency by the Democratic Party just so that everybody can align themselves behind Hillary Clinton? But I digress. So in and of itself, conflict is kind of a tool to create consensus, to create public discourse. Conflicts are an inherent constraint within a social structure, and public relations professionals sometimes use conflict to generate controversy, to arouse awareness about a particular topic. Controversies, again, often serve to shape public opinion intensively and extensively.